First off, I want to thank you all for the amazing support you've shown to the podcast. If you find it difficult to gain and finish hours-long 8 to 10 podcasts per week, please subscribe to most advanced featured and accurate quick podcasts. Summaries on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. You can start with free trial, which lets you listen all the podcasts and later, just for the price of candy in most places. It will save you from spending 15 to 20 hours per week catching up. Here is a rundown on the war on speech and those who dare to fight it, featuring Ezra Levant by Jordan Peterson. Here's the story of how Ezra Levant, the founder of Rebel News, and Jordan Peterson first met. It was back in 2016 when Peterson was speaking out against Canada's Bill C-16 at the University of Toronto. Rebel News, which was still in its early days, was there to cover the event and provide a platform for Peterson's views. Ezra Levant remembers seeing Peterson standing outside the university, making the case for free speech, while being shouted down by Antifa types with loudspeakers. Rebel News had their cameras there, and they were curious about this courageous professor who was willing to take a stand. Peterson and Levant shifted talking about their shared experiences with censorship and the manipulation of information by big tech companies. Peterson shared an example of how his YouTube channel was affected when someone scrubbed his name from the autofill search bar, making it harder for people to find his videos.
Levant revealed that a Google insider had shown him internal chats where Google employees were discussing and criticizing Rebel News, and that Mark Zuckerberg had essentially confessed to manipulating discoverability on Facebook. The conversation turned to the topic of government funding for legacy media in Canada, with Levant estimating that around 30% of a typical journalist's salary is subsidized by the government.
Peterson joked that the CBC's YouTube videos only get hundreds of views, but Levant pointed out that the government is paying for a certain message to be promoted. They also discussed the role of fact-checkers, such as NewsGuard, which is funded by the U.S. government and gives websites a rating based on their political views.
Levant called it a bee exercise that censors opinions, not facts.
Peterson shared two shocking realities he had discovered in the last 10 years. One was that the public education system was created by fascist industrialists to produce unthinking workers, and the other was that the food pyramid was formulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a marketing ploy that would cause an epidemic of obesity and diabetes.
Levant added that these are long-standing problems, but there are also crisis ideas that are throttled around elections, such as the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Peterson had talked to Miranda Devine, who broke the story for the New York Post, and was shocked by the tsunami of lies that followed, including the claim that it was Russian disinformation. The conversation was a walk down memory lane, but also a discussion of the current state of free speech and the manipulation of information.
Rebel News has been a thorn in the side of the establishment, and Levant has a new book coming out called Deal of the Century, the America First Plan for Canada's Oil Sands. They discussed how the intelligence agencies had signed a document stating that the information had the hallmarks of a Russian disinformation campaign, but not that it actually was one.
Peterson noted that this was a deceitful move, as they knew it wasn't a hoax but wanted to walk the line in case it came back to bite them. He also expressed sympathy for Mark Zuckerberg, who had made mistakes but was under a lot of pressure from the White House. Peterson then talked about his Peterson Academy, which he shifted to address the ideological rigidity of the university. He explained that they use technology to film the best lectures on any topic and bring them to a wide audience at a low cost. He also mentioned that they have about 40 courses on their platform and that they're producing more.
Ezra Levant chimed in, saying that Elon Musk had revealed what happened to Twitter, but that other platforms like YouTube, Google, Facebook, and Instagram hadn't been as forthcoming. He noted that Musk was unusual in his willingness to open up about what was happening behind the scenes.
Peterson brought up the topic of TikTok, saying that it's run by the Chinese communists and is warping a whole generation of young women. He also mentioned that the Chinese communists are fomenting discord using TikTok.
Levant added that TikTok is addictive and that its algorithm knows what you like almost more than you do.
The conversation then turned to the topic of AI, with Peterson noting that it's a dreadful war because AI systems use reinforcement learning and are very lifelike. He also mentioned that Musk's take on it is that it's better for him to be in control of AI than the Chinese.
Levant agreed, saying that Trump had decided that if there's going to be AI, it should be in America rather than in China.
Peterson then talked about his experience with free speech, saying that he had been invited to speak at a university, but was met with resistance from radicals who brought white noise blasters to drown him out. Levant noted that it felt like a struggle session, with the radicals trying to put a hat on Peterson and make him confess.
The conversation also touched on the topic of crowdfunding, with Levant noting that it's a way for people to support causes that they believe in, even if institutions are against them.
Peterson mentioned that he had met Lauren Southern, a young woman who had been through a rough time, and that Rebel News had met some colorful characters over the years.
Levant talked about his experience with Sun News Network, a TV station that was euthanized by the Canadian TV regulator, the CRT. He noted that he had resolved to never put himself in a position where a government regulator could do that to him again. And that's why he went all internet with Rebel News.
Peterson asked Levant how he saw the opportunity to use YouTube, and Levant explained that he had a YouTube experience that had saved his life. He told the story of how he had published the Danish cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad in his print magazine, The Western Standard, and how it had caused a fuss. He noted that YouTube had allowed him to reach a wider audience and to speak out against the censorship that he had faced. Every mainstream media outlet panicked and refused to show these cartoons, which actually added to the menace of the situation. The Wall Street Journal, CNN, New York Times, none of them would show the cartoons, and that made people think they must be awful. But in fact, they were pretty banal. Nothing more controversial than what you'd see in any major newspaper on any subject.
Ezra's magazine, The Western Standard, decided to publish the cartoons, and they did it in a think piece kind of way. They didn't put the cartoon on the cover, but rather tucked it inside. And they made the point that not all Muslims hold that you can't depict Muslims. By the time the magazine came out, it was clear that they were the only ones in the country who were going to do this.
Jordan Peterson chimed in, saying that they were almost the only people in the world who published the cartoons.
As a result, Ezra's phones rang off the hook, and a lot of people who called were Muslim exiles who said they didn't come to Canada to have Sharia law follow them across the world. Ezra found that very encouraging, and mostly people just appreciated the fact that they let them decide for themselves. However, the Alberta Human Rights Commission, a government agency, came after Ezra, and he was charged with publishing something that was likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt. It's actually a power to silence. Ezra was pursued by the commission for 900 days, and the apex of that was when he managed to convince the interrogator to allow him to make a record of his interrogation. The interrogator asked Ezra why he published the cartoons, and Ezra's response was, "Because it's my bloody right to do so." He didn't try to appease the interrogator or explain himself. He just stated his right. Ezra recorded the interrogation and uploaded it to YouTube, which was a new platform at the time. The video went viral, and hundreds of thousands of people saw it. Ezra's experience with the Alberta Human Rights Commission was a canary in the coal mine, and it showed him the power of the internet. He was able to fund his lawyer through PayPal, and blogging was a thing back then. The commission offered him a deal, saying that if he paid the complainant $8,000 and gave him a page in the magazine to write whatever he wanted, they would let him go. But Ezra refused, and instead, he fought the case for 3 years. Tommy had put up a video on Twitter, and a judge told him to take it down. But Tommy refused, and he was brought before the judge. The judge offered him a deal, saying that if he took down the video, he would lop months off his sentence. But Tommy refused, and he was sentenced to the maximum. Ezra visited Tommy in Spain and came back with him on the flight, thinking that he would be arrested the minute he landed. Ezra said that Tommy has flaws, but he also has a rare quality, the ability to stand up for what he believes in, even when it's hard. The video that Tommy put up had been seen 55 million times, and the judge was trying to get him to take it down. But Tommy refused, and now the video has over 150 million views. Elon Musk even retweeted it, and the world is talking about it. Ezra said that the law isn't used to dealing with people who are not rationalizing, maximizing the optimal outcome, reducing pain. Tommy is currently in solitary confinement, and he's been there for over 100 days. The authorities have forbidden anyone with a social media following to visit him, which is a weird rule. Ezra was scheduled to visit Tommy on February 16th, but he just got a letter from the authorities saying that he's not allowed to visit. Ezra Levant recently visited him and reported that he was in high spirits initially, but now he's falling apart. The prison governor has banned visitors, citing Tommy's social media presence as the reason. However, Ezra believes this is a form of mental torture, and solitary confinement is not a suitable punishment for a civil prisoner like Tommy. Tommy's family cannot fill all his visiting slots, and Ezra wants to visit him to report on his health and well-being. However, the prison governor is delaying, and Ezra suspects they would like Tommy to die in prison. Ezra is willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement to visit Tommy, but the prison governor is still hesitant. Ezra explains that Tommy's imprisonment is a battle between him and the government over what is true. The judge in Tommy's case said that what he put online was not admissible in court, but that doesn't mean it's not true or useful. Ezra believes that Tommy's victory is magnified by his refusal to back down, and the government doesn't know how to deal with him. Ezra also shares his experience of visiting the UK, which he calls a dystopian time machine. He sees what the future holds for Canada if they don't change course on matters like mass immigration. He mentions the ultra-low emission zones, which he believes are our way to control people's movements and limit their freedom. Ezra then shares a story about Tommy Robinson, who used to work for Rebel News. He mentions that Tommy is a skeptic and critic of Islam, and that's why he's being targeted by the government. Ezra also talks about the gangs in UK prisons, which are dominated by Muslims, and how Tommy's presence in prison is a threat to them. The conversation then shifts to Ezra's own experience of being arrested in Toronto. He was taking a picture of a Hamas protest in his neighborhood when the police escorted him away, citing that his presence could incite the protesters to breach the peace. Ezra was handcuffed, searched, and put in a cell, but he wasn't charged with anything. He believes that the police were just doing their job, but he was mad at the system that allowed this to happen. Ezra also mentions his colleague, David Menzies, who is a shoe-leather journalist and has reported on several controversial stories, including a trans professor who was kicked out of a swimming pool for pointing out that a trans woman was on the team with a 13-year-old girl. Ezra praises David for his bravery in covering these stories, which many other journalists wouldn't dare to touch. One instance was when he asked a liberal politician about banning a certain Iranian terror group. The RSMP swarmed him, pushed him against the wall, and charged him with assault. However, when the footage of the incident surfaced, the charges were dropped. He was beaten by Trudeau's RCMP bodyguards and let go without being arrested or charged. Rebel News, a media outlet, covered the trucker convoy in Canada, which was a peaceful protest against the government's COVID-19 policies. However, the police shot their reporter, Alexa Lebois, in the leg with a riot gun. The police claimed it was an accident, but Rebel News is suing them for the incident. Ezra Levant, the founder of Rebel News, spoke about the challenges they face in reporting on the government's actions. He mentioned that they had to bring their whole team to Montreal to cover the curfew, as the police were harassing their reporters. They even had to take a lawyer with them to engage with the police. One night, they were reporting on the streets during the curfew, and the police showed up at their Airbnb houseboat, sealing it off with yellow tape and trying to search the premises without a warrant. Rebel News also covers international events, such as the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Levant described the WEF as a crypto government, where the elites meet to discuss and implement policies without any opposition or journalistic scrutiny. He mentioned that the WEF is a pay-to-play arrangement where journalists are not allowed to ask tough questions. Levant also spoke about the WEF's initiatives such as Net Zero and ESG, which he believes are pathological and twisted.
Levant and Peterson agreed that the WEF is a place where the elites meet to conspire and impose their will on the world without any democratic standing or opposition. But it's also a place where the wealthy elite can be seen flaunting their wealth and hypocrisy. Take the private jets, for example. They fly in on private jets, which then have to fly to another airport to park. And then they take helicopters to get to their destinations. It's a staggering display of wealth and excess. But it's not just the private jets that are the problem. They're advocating for a reduction in private car ownership and a shift to public transportation. But they themselves are not willing to give up their own luxurious lifestyles.
As Ezra Levant points out, it's a case of do as I say, not as I do. Take the example of the energy bars that were being handed out at Davos. They were made with insect protein, but the packaging didn't mention that. Instead, it used the Latin genus and species for the mealworms. It's a clever way of hiding the truth from consumers, and it's just one example of the kind of manipulation that's going on at Davos. Ezra Levant and his team at Rebel News have been doing some excellent work in exposing the hypocrisy and corruption at Davos. They've been asking tough questions and getting some surprising answers. Take the example of Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. When Levant asked him about his company's stance on ESG, Fink refused to answer. Instead, he took out his phone and shifted, taking pictures of Levant and his team. It's a classic example of how the powerful try to intimidate and silence their critics. But despite the challenges, Rebel News is continuing to do some excellent work in exposing the truth about Davos and the World Economic Forum. They're a small team, but they're making a big impact. And they're not just focused on Davos. They're also covering other important stories, like the Tommy Robinson case in the UK. Robinson, a British activist, has been a thorn in the side of the establishment for years. And Rebel News has been covering this story extensively. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Tommy Robinson case is the way the establishment has tried to silence him. They've accused him of being a racist and a fascist, but the reality is that he's just a working-class guy who's trying to speak out against the corruption and hypocrisy of the elite. And he's not alone. There are millions of people around the world who are feeling the same way. They're fed up with the lies and the manipulation, and they're starting to speak out. They're terrified of anyone who dares to challenge their authority and expose their hypocrisy. But they're not going to be able to silence them. The truth is going to come out, and it's going to be a reckoning. In Canada, the situation is just as dire. The legacy media is in decline, and the CBC is a shadow of its former self.
They're still trying to silence critics like Ezra Levant and Jordan Peterson. But it's not going to work. The truth is going to come out, and it's going to be a reckoning. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, is trying to make a comeback in Canadian politics. But Canadians are not buying it. They're starting to see through the lies and the manipulation. And they're starting to speak out. The situation in Canada is dire, but it's not hopeless. There are still people like Ezra Levant and Jordan Peterson who are willing to speak out against the corruption and hypocrisy of the elite. And there are still people like Tommy Robinson who are willing to challenge the establishment and fight for the truth. The battle is far from over, but the tide is starting to turn. The truth is going to come out, and it's going to be a reckoning. Trump is an entertainer and a master of the insulting nickname, always looking for ways to poke at Justin Trudeau. Trudeau has been degrading and demoralizing the country, cutting people off from their roots and history. He's apologized for the country's past, calling it genocidal and sexist, and has insulted Daniel Smith for not being patriotic enough. Jordan Peterson chimes in, noting that Trudeau has destroyed the economy and made it impossible for young people to buy homes or start a life. The average Canadian is no longer wealthier than their American counterpart, and the country's institutions are eroding. When Trump offers Canada a deal, it's plausible that many young men would take him up on it.
Ezra Levant points out that Mark Carney, a potential Liberal leader, is a smart and charismatic figure with international experience and credibility. However, he's also deeply connected to China and has ties to Iran, which is concerning. Carney has announced his candidacy on an American TV channel, which is unprecedented and absurd. If he wins, he'll likely do a deal with the NBP and become prime minister without ever having won an election.
Jordan Peterson thinks that Canada has learned nothing from its mistakes and is still clinging to its status as a first-ranked nation. The country is lucky to be next to the U.S., which has helped it economically and culturally. These small victories show that the U.S. is willing to stand up for its values, unlike Canada, which has become a nation of virtue signalers.
Ezra Levant shares a story about the Amish, a Christian community that doesn't use modern technology. During the pandemic, they were fined $6,000 every time they crossed the border into Canada because they didn't have smartphones to download the Arrivacan app. The fines added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the community was forced to sell their farms to pay off the debt. Ezra's organization, Rebel News, has helped the Amish by dispatching lawyers to crack open the cases and redo them. The incident highlights the absurdity of the Canadian bureaucracy and its willingness to punish those who don't conform. Ezra Levant pointed out that despite the absurdity of the situation, not one person involved in the project questioned what was happening. This led to a broader discussion about the persecution of certain groups, including the Amish, who were politicized under the Biden administration due to crackdowns on raw milk. Ezra mentioned that the Amish, known for their non-political nature, became politicized and even supported Trump, as seen in footage of horses and carriages with Trump flags. The Amish in Canada, however, are being helped by the Democracy Fund, which Ezra is pleased about. The conversation then shifted to Rebel News, with Ezra sharing that the organization is mainly operating in Canada, but also has reporters in other countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom. He mentioned that Rebel News loves to travel to cover important stories, such as the Freedom of Speech rally in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where they witnessed a massive crowd of people rallying for freedom of speech. Ezra also shared a recent story about the town of Lahaina in Maui, where wildfires destroyed the town 18 months ago, and yet only 5% of the lots have been rebuilt. Instead, FEMA has set up camps of tiny homes, and there are schemes to take the land for low-income housing and environmental projects. He shared an anecdote about visiting the town of Dundrum, Ireland, which was taken over by 240 military-aged migrant men, effectively making it a minority Irish village.
Jordan Peterson expressed his confusion and frustration with Ireland's welcoming of this change, given its history of resisting domination. He encouraged people to visit Ireland while it's still Irish, as the country's rapidly changing. Thank you for tuning in. Please click follow button, and just remember, subscription is only £1 or $1 per month. Leave a comment or review. Until next time, happy listening.